The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and within 5 minutes it had forced our entire family to say a name we had avoided for 10 years. I still remember the exact moment because everything changed after that. My name is Emily Carter, and for most of my life, I believe my older sister deserved what happened to her. That sounds terrible now, but back then it felt true. For 10 years, nobody in our family spoke about Rachel unless it was absolutely necessary. Her photographs slowly disappeared from shelves. Her birthday passed without phone calls. Her name became something people carefully stepped around during holiday dinners. It was as if she had been erased from the family history. We continued writing without her. Yet on that Tuesday morning, a single envelope brought her back into the center of our lives. The envelope arrived by certified mail at our family home outside Columbus, Ohio. The house had belonged to our parents for more than 30 years. It sat on 8 acres of land and had always been considered the heart of our family. Birthday parties happened there. Thanksgiving dinners happened there. Every major family memory seemed connected to that house. But now we were in danger of losing it. Rising property taxes, medical expenses, and a series of financial setbacks had pushed my parents into a difficult situation. My father was 74. My mother was 72. Neither of them talked openly about money, but everyone knew things were becoming serious. When my father opened the envelope, his expression changed immediately. My mother noticed first. "What is it?" she asked. He did not answer. He simply continued reading. Then he lowered the paper and stared at the kitchen table. The room became unusually quiet. I happened to be visiting that morning because I worked remotely and often helped my parents with paperwork. "Dad," I asked, "what happened?" Slowly, he slid the document across the table toward me. At the top was the name of a law firm I did not recognize. Beneath it was language filled with legal terminology. But one line immediately caught my attention. I read it twice because I could not believe what I was seeing. Then I read it. A third time. There it was. Rachel Carter. For a moment, I honestly thought it had to be a mistake. 10 years. 10 entire years had passed since anyone connected to our family had received official correspondence involving my sister. Yet her name was sitting there in black ink on expensive legal stationery. "Why would a lawyer be contacting us about Rachel?" my mother whispered. Nobody had an answer. My father rubbed his forehead and stared toward the window. He suddenly looked older than I remembered. "I do not know," he admitted. "But apparently, she owns something connected to this property." The words landed like a thunderclap. Rachel owned something connected to our property? That made no sense. She had left this house at 28 years old carrying 2 suitcases and less than $500. At least that was the story everyone told. According to family history, Rachel struggled after leaving. She moved from city to city, took temporary jobs, lost contact with relatives, built a life somewhere else. None of us knew the details because none of us asked. The truth was simpler and uglier. We stopped looking. I continued reading the letter. The legal firm requested a meeting. Representatives wanted to discuss a trust, ownership interests, and a proposal involving the Carter family property. Every sentence created more confusion. By lunchtime, several relatives had arrived after hearing the news. My uncle, 2 cousins, even my grandmother. Everyone sat around the same kitchen table where so many family decisions had been made over the years. The letter passed from hand to hand. Every person reacted the same way. Shock, confusion, disbelief. Then the questions started. Where was Rachel? Why was her name connected to our house? What had she been doing for the last decade? Most importantly, why was she reaching out now? Nobody knew. As the conversations grew louder around me, I found myself staring at the signature on the final page. Rachel Carter. 10 years earlier, our family had pushed her out the front door and convinced ourselves we would never need her again. Yet now, when everything seemed to be falling apart, her name had returned. And somehow, deep down, I felt certain that this letter was only the beginning of a story none of us were prepared to hear. That night, after everyone finally left my parents' house, I could not stop thinking about Rachel. The legal letter sat on the kitchen counter like a ghost from another lifetime. Every time I looked at it, memories I had spent years avoiding began returning one by one. For most of my childhood, Rachel was not just my older sister. She was my hero. She taught me how to ride a bicycle. She helped me with homework when math made me cry. She sat through endless school concerts and soccer games because our parents were often busy working. If someone had told 12-year-old Emily that one day our family would stop speaking to Rachel entirely, I would have laughed. It would have sounded impossible. Yet somehow that impossible future became reality. The truth is that families rarely break apart all at once. The damage usually happens slowly. Small disagreements become larger ones. Hurt feelings remain unresolved. Assumptions replace conversations. Looking back now, I can see the cracks forming years before everything finally collapsed. Rachel had always been different from the rest of us. She was independent. She asked difficult questions. She challenged decisions that other family members simply accepted. My father often interpreted that independence as disrespect. My mother believed Rachel was stubborn. Relatives described her as difficult. Rachel described herself differently. She called it honesty. For a long time, those differences caused occasional arguments, but nothing serious. Then my grandfather died. Everything changed after that. My grandfather owned the land surrounding our family home, nearly 20 acres that had been in our family for generations. After his death, questions about inheritance created tensions nobody knew how to handle. My father wanted to preserve everything exactly as it was. Rachel believed part of the property should be sold to reduce debt and help stabilize the family's finances. At the time, her suggestion felt shocking. To many relatives, selling family land sounded almost like betrayal. Every family gathering became another debate. Every discussion became more emotional. Eventually, people stopped hearing Rachel's concerns and started judging her motives instead. I remember one Sunday dinner in particular. The conversation began politely, but quickly deteriorated. My father accused Rachel of caring more about money than family tradition. Rachel insisted she was trying to prevent future financial problems. Neither side backed down. Voices grew louder. Emotions took control. That dinner ended with relatives choosing sides around the table. Looking back now, I realized something important. Nobody was truly discussing land anymore. They were discussing pride, fear, and unresolved frustrations. The argument became symbolic of everything that had been building for years. Over the following months, relationships deteriorated rapidly. Rachel moved out of the family home and rented a small apartment across town. Contact became less frequent. Holiday invitations felt strained. Phone calls became rare. Then came the night everything finally shattered. I was 25 years old. Rachel was 28. Another family meeting had been called to discuss finances. The conversation quickly returned to familiar territory. Accusations. Defensiveness. Old wounds reopening once again. I remember sitting silently in the corner while everyone talked over one another. Then my father stood up and said words none of us ever expected to hear. He told Rachel that if she disliked the family's decisions so much, perhaps she should stop considering herself part of them. The room went completely silent. Rachel looked stunned. Even my mother seemed shocked. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Rachel quietly stood up. Tears filled her eyes, but her voice remained steady. She looked around the room at every person she loved. "One day," she said softly, "I hope you understand that everything I said was because I was trying to help." No one answered. Not even me. That is the part one regret most. I said nothing. I watched my sister walk toward the front door carrying the weight of an entire family's rejection. She left that night with 2 suitcases and a broken heart. By morning, she was gone. And over time, we convinced ourselves that she would never matter to our lives again. Now, 10 years later, her name had returned through a lawyer's letter. As I stared at the document on the counter, one painful question kept repeating in my mind. What if Rachel had been right all along? The meeting with the lawyers was scheduled for the following Friday, which gave our family 4 long days to sit with unanswered questions. Those days felt strangely uncomfortable. For years, Rachel had existed only as a memory, a mistake people referenced when discussing the past. Suddenly, she had become real again. Not physically present, but undeniably real. Every conversation somehow returned to her. Every question led back to the same mystery. What had happened after she left? The truth was that none of us knew. We had spent 10 years assuming we understood Rachel's story without ever bothering to learn it. On Thursday evening, while helping my parents organize old paperwork for the upcoming meeting, I discovered a storage box in the basement. It was filled with photographs, school records, and family keepsakes. Most of it had not been touched in years. As I sorted through the contents, I found a small envelope tucked between 2 photo albums. Written across the front was Rachel's name. Inside were several newspaper clippings. At first they seemed unrelated. Then I noticed the dates. The earliest article was from 9 years ago. It described a young woman who had launched a small consulting business in Indianapolis. The accompanying photograph was grainy, but I immediately recognized her. Rachel. My heart began racing. Why had nobody told us about this? I continued reading. The article mentioned that she started the company from a one-room office after spending years working multiple jobs. According to the story, she often worked 16-hour days while attending evening classes to complete additional certifications. The next article was from 7 years ago. Her company had expanded into 3 states. Another article followed 2 years later. Then another. Each one documented a new achievement. More employees. More clients. More growth. I felt stunned. The version of Rachel we carried in our minds was completely different. We imagined someone struggling alone after leaving home. We imagined failure because failure made our decisions easier to justify. Success would have forced us to question ourselves. I carried the clippings upstairs and showed them to my father. He read every article without speaking. The silence in the room grew heavier with each page. When he finally looked up, his expression was impossible to read. Regret, pride, sadness, perhaps all 3. She did all of this herself, my mother whispered. Nobody disagreed. The following morning, our family gathered at the law office downtown. The conference room overlooked the city skyline. Large windows filled the space with sunlight, yet the atmosphere felt tense. A senior attorney named Daniel Foster entered carrying a thick folder. After brief introductions, he sat down and opened the file. Before we discuss the property, he said, there are several facts your family should understand. Every person at the table leaned forward. Daniel explained that Rachel had spent the past decade building one of the fastest-growing regional business advisory firms in the Midwest. The company now employed more than 200 people. Multiple offices operated across several states. Industry organizations regularly recognized her work. I glanced around the room. Faces that once dismissed Rachel now reflected pure disbelief. But Daniel was not finished. He slid several documents across the table. Your sister's success is not actually the reason we are meeting today. The room became perfectly still. 3 years ago, he continued, Rachel created a family trust. My father frowned. A family trust? Daniel nodded. Yes. The trust was specifically designed to protect certain assets connected to the Carter family. Confusion spread across the table. None of it made sense. Why would Rachel create something intended to help a family that had pushed her away? Daniel turned another page in the file. Over the last decade, Rachel quietly acquired multiple ownership interests related to debts and obligations connected to this property. She did so without informing family members. My pulse quickened. The lawyer paused before delivering the sentence that changed everything. The reason your family home still belongs to you today is because Rachel spent years making sure it would never be lost. The conference room remained silent long after Daniel finished speaking. I looked around the table and saw the same expression on every face. Shock. Not the kind that fades after a few seconds. The kind that forces you to reevaluate years of assumptions. My father stared at the documents in front of him as if they belonged to someone else. My mother kept rereading the same page without turning it. Even my uncle, who always seemed to have an opinion about everything, sat completely speechless. Daniel allowed the silence to linger before opening another section of the file. I think it may help if you understand exactly what happened, he said. He slid several financial statements toward us. The paperwork revealed a story none of us had imagined. About 8 years earlier, a portion of debt connected to the family property had been sold to an outside investment group. At the time, nobody in our family knew it had happened. The transaction was legal and routine. Had events continued normally, additional financial pressures could eventually have placed the property at risk. But before that could happen, Rachel quietly purchased the debt through a separate business entity. Nobody connected the purchase to her. Nobody realized she was involved. According to the records, she continued doing this whenever new financial complications appeared. Property tax obligations, refinancing issues, outstanding liabilities. Time after time, she stepped in from a distance. Not once did she inform our parents. Not once did she request recognition. Why? My mother finally whispered. Daniel glanced down at a letter resting inside the folder. Rachel answered that question herself. My heart immediately began racing. He carefully unfolded the document and began reading. Family is not always defined by how people treat us during difficult moments. Sometimes family is defined by what we choose to do after those moments have passed. The room grew still again. Daniel continued. I left because staying had become impossible. But I never stopped caring about the people I left behind. My father lowered his eyes. I had never seen him look so defeated. The land was never the real issue, Daniel read. The real issue was fear. Everyone was afraid of losing something important. Unfortunately, fear has a way of making people see enemies where none exist. Every sentence felt like a direct challenge to the version of history our family had carried for 10 years. Rachel was not writing with anger. She was not defending herself. If anything, she sounded surprisingly compassionate. After I left, I promised myself that I would build a life I could be proud of. I worked hard. I made mistakes. I learned more than I ever expected. But no matter where life took me, I never forgot where I came from. Daniel stopped reading and handed the letter to my father. The old man stared at the pages for a long moment before speaking. She should have hated us. Nobody answered because many of us were thinking the same thing. Instead of resentment, Rachel had chosen responsibility. Instead of revenge, she had chosen protection. The contrast felt almost impossible to understand. The meeting continued for another hour. We learned that Rachel's company had grown far beyond anything we imagined. We learned that she owned several successful businesses. We learned that her charitable foundation funded scholarships and community programs throughout the Midwest. Every new fact widened the gap between the woman we thought we knew and the woman she had actually become. Yet one question remained unanswered. Why had she never contacted us directly? As the meeting drew to a close, Daniel reached into the folder one final time. There is something else, he said. He placed a sealed envelope in the center of the table. Across the front, written in familiar handwriting, were 6 simple words. To be opened by my family. My pulse quickened instantly. The letter we had just heard explained what Rachel had done. But somehow I knew this envelope would explain something far more important. It would explain why she spent 10 years helping people who had spent 10 years forgetting her. Nobody moved for several seconds after Daniel placed the envelope on the table. It was strange how something so small could feel so important. For 10 years, Rachel had been absent from our lives. Now her voice seemed closer than ever. My father finally reached for the envelope. His hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal. The room remained silent as he unfolded the pages inside. Then he began reading aloud. If you are reading this letter, then you already know more about my life than you have known in the past 10 years. You know what I built. You know what I protected. What you still do not know is why I chose to do it. My chest tightened. Those were the questions all of us wanted answered. The easy version of this story would be that I left angry and spent years trying to prove everyone wrong. That version would make sense. It would probably make some people feel better. Unfortunately, it is not true. My father paused briefly before continuing. The truth is that I was angry when I left. I was hurt. I felt rejected by the people I loved most. There were days when I convinced myself I would never speak to any of you again. There were nights when loneliness felt impossible to escape. The words landed heavily because they felt honest. Not dramatic. Not exaggerated. Just painfully honest. During my first year away, I worked 3 jobs. I rented a studio apartment that barely had enough room for a bed and a table. Some weeks I counted every dollar before buying groceries. There were moments when giving up seemed easier than continuing. My mother lowered her eyes. Tears slowly appeared. I knew she was imagining her daughter facing those struggles completely alone. What changed my life was something Grandpa once told me when I was a child. He said that character is revealed not by how people treat us when life is easy, but by how we respond when life becomes difficult. Daniel had stopped reading. My father continued in a quieter voice. I realized I had a choice. I could spend the rest of my life replaying old arguments, or I could build something better. I chose to build. I felt my throat tighten. The letter continued describing years of relentless work. Rachel studied at night, worked during the day, took risks, failed more than once, started over repeatedly. Nothing had been handed to her. Every achievement came through persistence. Yet what affected me most was what came next. People often assume success erased the pain. It did not. Success changes circumstances. It does not automatically heal old wounds. The room grew quiet again. Every birthday, I wondered how everyone was doing. Every Thanksgiving, I remembered the kitchen table. Every Christmas, I thought about home. Distance protected me, but it never stopped me from caring. My father's voice broke slightly as he read the next paragraph. When I learned the family property was facing financial challenges, I saw an opportunity to help. Not because anyone asked, not because anyone apologized. I helped because protecting family should not depend on receiving credit. Tears now streamed openly down my mother's face. Even my uncle looked emotional. For years we imagined Rachel had forgotten us. Instead, she had been quietly watching from afar, making sure we never lost everything. Then came the final page. There is one thing I hope all of you understand. The night I left, I lost my family. But I never stopped loving them. Love is strange that way. Sometimes it survives even when relationships do not. I felt a wave of guilt unlike anything I had experienced before. Rachel spent 10 years carrying pain without turning it into bitterness. We spent 10 years carrying assumptions without questioning them. As my father lowered the final page, nobody spoke. Then Daniel quietly cleared his throat. There is one more thing Rachel asked me to tell you. Every head lifted. The attorney looked around the room before speaking. She will be in Columbus next week for the first time in 10 years. And she has agreed to meet with your family if you wish to see her. The moment Daniel announced that Rachel had agreed to meet us, the entire room seemed to shift. For 10 years, Rachel had existed only in memories, assumptions, and unanswered questions. Now she was suddenly real again. She was coming back to Columbus. She was willing to sit across from the very people who had pushed her away. As we left the law office that afternoon, nobody seemed quite sure how to feel. Relief mixed with anxiety. Gratitude mixed with guilt. Hope mixed with fear. During the drive home, my parents barely spoke. My father kept both hands firmly on the steering wheel while staring straight ahead. My mother looked out the window the entire time. I knew exactly what they were thinking because I was thinking it too. What do you say to someone after 10 years of silence? The days leading up to the meeting felt unusually long. Every family member seemed to be processing the situation differently. My uncle spent hours reviewing old photographs. My grandmother repeatedly asked questions about Rachel's childhood. Even relatives who had been among her strongest critics now spoke about her with unexpected softness. It was as if the truth had forced everyone to revisit memories they had ignored for years. For me, the hardest part was confronting my own role in what happened. I kept replaying the night Rachel left. Again and again, I remembered standing silently in that living room. I remembered watching her walk toward the front door. Most of all, I remembered doing nothing. At the time, I convinced myself it was not my place to interfere. Now that excuse felt hollow. Sometimes the greatest mistakes are not the things we do. Sometimes they are the things we fail to do. 3 days before the meeting, another package arrived at my parents' house. This one came directly from Rachel's office. Inside was a collection of documents related to the family trust. There were financial summaries, property records, and charitable contributions. But buried among the paperwork was something far more personal. A small leather notebook. Attached to the cover was a note in Rachel's handwriting. For Emily. My heart immediately began racing. I carefully opened the notebook. It was not a diary. It was a collection of thoughts written over several years. Some entries were only a few sentences long. Others filled entire pages. The first one I read was dated 8 years earlier. Today I drove past the old house. I stayed in the car and watched from across the road. Nothing seemed different. I wanted to stop. I wanted to knock on the door. Instead, I kept driving. My chest tightened. I turned another page. Emily would probably laugh if she saw the apartment I am living in right now. The kitchen is so small I can barely turn around. Still, it is mine. That feels important. Another entry. Business is improving. Sometimes I wish I could tell Dad. He would pretend not to be proud, but I know he would be. Tears blurred my vision. Every page revealed the same thing. Rachel never stopped thinking about us. Even during her busiest years. Even during her hardest moments. Then I reached an entry written only 6 months earlier. I heard the property may be facing new financial pressure. I hope I can help without making things more complicated. Family deserves stability even when relationships are broken. I closed the notebook and sat quietly for a long time. Rachel had every reason to move on. Every reason to forget us. Yet she continued carrying concern for people who rarely thought about her. The realization was overwhelming. Finally, the day of the meeting arrived. Our family gathered in a private room at a hotel near downtown Columbus. Nobody seemed comfortable. Conversations started and stopped. Coffee cups sat untouched. Every few minutes, someone glanced toward the door. Then, exactly at 2 o'clock, the handle slowly turned. The room instantly fell silent. 10 years of distance. 10 years of assumptions. 10 years of regret. All of it seemed to gather in that single moment as the door began to open and Rachel Carter stepped back into the lives she had left behind. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Rachel stood just inside the doorway, and the room seemed suspended between the past and the present. She looked different from the woman who had left 10 years earlier. More confident, more composed. Yet there was something familiar in her eyes that instantly transported me back to childhood. She wore a simple navy blazer and carried a leather portfolio under one arm. There was no sign of arrogance. No indication that she had spent the last decade building a life far beyond anything our family imagined. If anything, she looked slightly nervous. My mother was the first to stand. Tears filled her eyes almost immediately. For a moment, it seemed as though she wanted to say 100 different things at once. Instead, she simply whispered, "Rachel." My sister smiled softly. "Hi, Mom." The simplicity of those 2 words somehow made the moment even more emotional. My father remained seated for several seconds before finally standing as well. He looked older than the last time Rachel had seen him. His shoulders seemed heavier. His hair had turned almost completely gray. As he faced his daughter, the confidence that had once defined him appeared to disappear. "I do not know where to begin," he admitted quietly. Rachel nodded. "Neither do I." Nobody laughed, but the tension in the room eased slightly. We all took our seats around the large conference table. For a while, the conversation remained cautious. Questions about travel, questions about work, questions about health. Safe topics. Yet beneath every sentence lingered the same truth. We were all avoiding the real conversation. Finally, my father took a deep breath. I was wrong. The room immediately fell silent again. Rachel looked at him without speaking. "I spent years believing I was protecting this family," he continued. "The truth is that I pushed away one of the people who cared about it most." Tears filled his eyes. I had never seen my father cry before. Not once in my entire life. "I should have listened to you. I should have respected you. And I should never have allowed that night to happen." Nobody spoke. Nobody interrupted. We all understood how difficult those words were for him. Rachel sat quietly for several moments before answering. I spent a long time wishing I could hear that. Her voice remained calm, honest. But eventually I realized something. If I waited for the past to change, I would never move forward. My mother began crying openly. "How can you be so kind after everything?" Rachel looked down briefly before answering. "Because carrying anger for 10 years would have hurt me more than anyone else." The room grew still again. There was wisdom in her words that only comes from surviving difficult experiences. Then something happened that none of us expected. Rachel opened her portfolio and removed several documents. "There is another reason I wanted to meet." Everyone exchanged confused glances. She slid the papers across the table. "The family trust is fully funded," she explained. "The property is protected permanently. Property taxes, maintenance reserves, and future obligations have all been addressed." My uncle stared at the paperwork. "You already did all this?" Rachel nodded. "Several years ago." My father looked completely overwhelmed. "Why?" Rachel smiled sadly. "Because despite everything that happened, it is still home." I felt tears forming again. The answer perfectly captured who Rachel had become. She was not helping because she needed approval. She was not helping because she wanted recognition. She was helping because she genuinely cared. Then she looked around the table at every member of the family. "There is only one thing I want in return." The room became perfectly quiet. Nobody knew what she was about to ask. After everything she had done, she had earned the right to request almost anything. Yet when she finally spoke, her request left every person in the room speechless. "Promise me that from now on, when someone in this family has a different opinion, you will listen before deciding they do not belong." For a long moment after Rachel made her request, nobody spoke. The simplicity of her words somehow carried more weight than any financial gift ever could. She was not asking for gratitude. She was not asking for recognition. She was asking for something far more difficult. She was asking us to change. My father slowly nodded first. "I promise," he said quietly. His voice was filled with emotion. One by one, every person at the table made the same commitment. Some spoke confidently. Others struggled through tears. But all of us understood what Rachel meant. The family had not been damaged by a disagreement about property. It had been damaged by the belief that disagreement itself was unacceptable. We had confused loyalty with obedience. We had mistaken silence for peace. Rachel had paid the price for that mistake. After the meeting ended, none of us seemed ready to leave. 10 years of distance could not be erased in a single afternoon, but something important had begun. We moved to a nearby restaurant overlooking the Scioto River. The atmosphere felt different from the formal tension of the conference room. Conversations became easier. Stories began to surface. Memories returned. For the first time in years, Rachel was no longer a subject being discussed. She was simply part of the family again. As we sat together, I found myself watching her closely. There was confidence in the way she carried herself, but there was also humility. She listened carefully when others spoke. She laughed easily. She asked questions about people she had not seen in years, and somehow remembered details everyone else had forgotten. At one point, my grandmother reached across the table and squeezed Rachel's hand. "I missed you," she whispered. Rachel smiled gently. "I missed you too." It was such a small exchange, yet it seemed to capture everything that had been lost and everything that was now being rebuilt. Later that evening, Rachel and I found ourselves walking alone along the riverfront. The city lights reflected across the water while the sounds of traffic drifted through the distance. For several minutes, neither of us said anything. Then I finally spoke. "I am sorry." Rachel looked at me, but remained silent. "I should have called. I should have reached out. I should have done something." The words came out faster than I intended. Years of guilt seemed to spill forward all at once. Instead, I did nothing. Rachel stopped walking and leaned against the railing. "Emily, do you know something I learned over the last 10 years? I shook my head. People usually do the best they can with what they understand at the time. I stared at her in disbelief. "You are making excuses for me." She smiled softly. "No, I am offering perspective." I felt tears forming again. "I do not deserve that." Rachel looked out across the river before answering. "Maybe not. But forgiveness is not about deserving. If it were, nobody would receive it." Those words stayed with me. They revealed more about Rachel's growth than any business achievement ever could. Success had changed her circumstances, but hardship had shaped her character. Before we returned to the restaurant, she reached into her bag and handed me a photograph. It was an old picture of the two of us sitting on the front porch of the family house. I could not have been older than 8. Rachel looked about 18. We were laughing at something neither of us could remember now. "I carried that picture with me for years," she said. My eyes widened. "Why?" Rachel smiled. "Because no matter how far away I went, I never wanted to forget where I started." I stared at the photograph as emotion tightened my throat. 10 years earlier, we thought Rachel had left us behind. The truth was almost impossible to accept. She had carried pieces of us with her the entire time. As we walked back toward the restaurant, surrounded by the glow of city lights and the quiet sounds of the evening, I realized something important. The greatest surprise was not that Rachel had become successful. The greatest surprise was that after everything she endured, she had somehow managed to keep her heart open. The weeks that followed felt different from anything our family had experienced in years. For the first time in a very long time, conversations were no longer shaped by old arguments or silent resentments. They were shaped by honesty. Rachel remained in Columbus longer than anyone expected. What began as a single meeting gradually became a series of dinners, visits, and long conversations that stretched late into the evening. Nobody pretended the past had never happened. The wounds were real. The lost years were real. But something equally real was beginning to take their place. Understanding. One Sunday afternoon, our entire family gathered at the old house. The same house that had once stood at the center of so much conflict now felt strangely peaceful. Children played in the yard. Relatives sat on the porch sharing stories. My father spent nearly an hour walking through the property with Rachel. Watching them together felt almost surreal. 10 years earlier, neither of them could imagine this moment. Yet there they were, side by side, discussing repairs, memories, and plans for the future. At one point, I watched my father stop beside the large oak tree near the edge of the property. He turned toward Rachel and said something I could not hear. Rachel smiled and placed a hand on his shoulder. Whatever words were exchanged remained private, but I could see the relief on both their faces. Some conversations do not need witnesses. Some healing happens quietly. Later that afternoon, our family gathered around a long table in the backyard. As dinner came to an end, my grandmother slowly stood up. The conversation faded immediately. Everyone looked toward her. She was 90 years old and rarely spoke for long periods anymore. So when she chose to stand, people listened. She looked around the table before finally speaking. Families survive because people choose love even when it is difficult. Her eyes settled on Rachel. Some of us forgot that for a while. The silence that followed carried more meaning than any speech. Then my grandmother smiled. Thankfully, one person remembered. Tears appeared in more than a few eyes. Rachel lowered her head slightly, clearly uncomfortable being the center of attention. That was another thing success had not changed. She never seemed interested in praise. As the evening continued, I found myself sitting beside her on the porch. The sun was beginning to set over the fields behind the house. Golden light covered the property. For several minutes, we simply watched the horizon. Finally, I asked a question that had been on my mind since everything began. Do you ever wish things had happened differently? Rachel considered the question carefully. Sometimes. She smiled softly. But if everything had happened differently, I might not have become the person I am now. I thought about that answer for a long time. Most people measure success through money, accomplishments, or recognition. Rachel had achieved all of those things. Yet sitting beside her, I realized none of them explained why everyone respected her so deeply. The real reason was character. Hardship had given her opportunities to become bitter, and she chose compassion instead. Rejection had given her reasons to walk away forever, and she chose loyalty instead. Years of silence had given her excuses to stop caring, and she chose love instead. As darkness slowly settled over the property, family members began gathering for one final photograph. Someone called Rachel toward the center of the group. She laughed and shook her head, insisting others stand in front. The photographer finally convinced her to join. As everyone gathered together, I looked around at the faces surrounding me. 10 years earlier, we thought we had lost a sister. In reality, we had lost our way. Rachel was never the person who abandoned the family. She was the person who believed in it even when the rest of us forgot how. The camera flashed. For a brief moment, everyone smiled together. And as I looked at that scene, I understood the lesson our family would carry forward for generations. The greatest gift Rachel gave us was not financial security. It was the chance to become a family again.